welcome to the Economist Annual Healthcare Forum. Last year, we took a broad look at the state of the oncology ecosystem and the key stakeholders. And today, we'll take a bit of a deeper cut and explore the role of innovation and collaboration in strengthening the healthcare ecosystem, as well as how to best scale value for patients and practitioners alike. We will grapple with key issues within financing, policy, prevention, early detection, treatment, long-term management of cancer, in the hopes of identifying critical next steps. So as we all know, medicine has done a great job at reducing deaths from heart disease and stroke, but a bit less so with cancer. And despite a 4-decade war against the disease, one that's cost hundreds of billions of dollars, we're really not where we want to be. Yet, increasingly, there is a sense that we're on the cusp of a shift in our technological capabilities in oncology. And although the metaphor of a war on cancer, I think, and I'm sure many of you do too, has long been misconceived, there is a sense that real progress is being made in this fight, one that I pick up when I report on this subject and I speak to people involved in cancer research and care. And this comes thanks to a much deeper understanding of cell biology and genetics. What's been hampering us all along has really been our ignorance. And there exists today a number of targeted therapies that are designed at the molecular level, as you know, along with chemotherapy, surgery, and radiotherapy, used singly and in combination. We've been seeing a slow and steady increase in survival rates in certain cancers. We know we can do it. There's a lot more to be done, and there are some promising new medications I know we're going to be talking about, immuno-oncology in particular. So the implications of our shift in thinking about cancer is that one day all drugs offered are really going to be driven by a sort of molecular understanding of what is driving this disease. With immunotherapy, there is a palpable excitement among scientists, investors, philanthropists, that we're about to make a big step in making cancer more survivable. And we'll hear about that today, as well as the challenges of investing in this space, which is very rapidly moving. And of course, we'll hear about paying for the resulting drugs. But increasingly, it seems to me anyway, our challenge is to kind of quickly assemble the pieces that are at our disposal. And this is an idea that's driving this sort of moonshot attempt at cancer, and that's something we'll hear about at the end of the day. So I would like to kick off our first session by welcoming our panelists onto stage.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Amitabh, and I hope you're all incredibly well caffeinated this morning, because I was told I have 8 minutes to educate you on the economics of cancer. So this will be a bit of a drink from a fire hose. I'm also surprised that someone invited an economist to open this thing, because I think of us economists as being like skunks at the garden party, because we often end up saying things, much like the magazine, we end up saying things that upset everybody. So I have a number of disclosures that are also on my Kennedy School website. I do advise the Congressional Budget Office on healthcare policy, but nothing I say today represents the views of the CBO, and I have received speaking fees from a number of organizations and companies, as well as being a consultant to Microsoft in precision health economics. So let me just kind of start off with this slide, which comes from IMS Health. This is telling us what is going on inside the large biopharma companies. So if you sort of peek under the hood and you look at what folks are working on, we see something like 6,200 molecules or ideas being researched right now. And you can see that about half of them are in the preclinical phase of discovery, and about 450 of them are undergoing phase 3 trials. Now, what's interesting to me is the blue boxes, because the blue boxes tell us the growing role of oncology in this pipeline. So somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 drugs that is currently being researched is an oncology drug. And as you can see from the pie charts, a very large fraction of those drugs tend to be large molecule biologics. Now, this is important because it's another way of saying if we think that we have problems or challenges in how we pay for cancer cure today, today's problems are going to be mosquito bites relative to the challenges that await us in the future. And I think the the one takeaway for all of us from this slide is we shouldn't wait for the future. We can look into the pipeline and get some sense of what these drugs look like and what they'll do. I wish we had done that with Gilead when they were down the path of giving us Sovaldi. Many people knew that the drug was about to launch, but the 50-state Medicaid directors sort of had their head in the sand about the launch of this drug with a very high budget impact. And we shouldn't do that with oncology. So I think it's not only a challenge of how we pay for those innovative therapies, there's also a huge challenge that oncologists and cancer centers will wrestle with. So look at this graph, which tells us what the expected arrival rate over the next 5 years of combinations of targeted and immuno-oncology agents will look like. So right now, in 2016, we're saying, boy, we're having a really hard time making sense of this incredibly crowded immunotherapy space. We've got something like 15 new immunotherapy agents, and I don't really know whether the one from Merck is better than the one from BMS. Well, again, that's a small problem relative to what the delivery system will confront in just 5 years. In 5 years, we're going to be seeing something like 34 of these combination therapies and immuno-oncology agents hitting the marketplace. So this is a way of saying, even if we figure out how to pay for the drugs, the great cancer centers in the United States and the oncologists who work within them are going to have to make sense of which drug is right for which patient, which is quite different than figuring out how do we pay for these drugs. It's really about, can we create physician expert systems that figure out which drugs are the right ones to be using in which patient groups? And that often requires data which is much richer than the data that was used to get FDA approval. And I don't think that we've done a particularly good job of collecting all of that data just yet. So that's, I think, a nice transition into the problem of costs and prices. So the launch prices from a lot of these drugs are extremely high, as this recent paper in Health Affairs points out. And I think Peter Bach, who I see in the audience, Peter has done some really interesting work pointing out that not only are the launch prices high, the price can vary incredibly based on indication. So you look at a drug like Tarceva, and this is Peter's table, so if there's any problems with it, he's sitting right over there. But Peter makes the really important point that if you look at the sort of, one kind of crude measure of cost effectiveness, which is sort of the cost per year of life gained, you look at Tarceva when it's used as first-line treatment of metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, it basically costs us about $180,000 to produce that life year. Now, this is not a life in perfect health, but let's just say it is, for argument's sake. $182,000 per life year is expensive, but there are ways to justify a cost like that. But now if I use the same drug in a different patient population, I use it for treating pancreatic cancer, I'm effectively paying $650,000. So this is an opportunity for all of us in the room to be thinking about ideas like indication-based pricing. Can we pay more to the manufacturer for the conditions, for the indications in which the drug works, and less in the indications where the drug does not work? Or can we charge higher coinsurance to patients in settings where the drug doesn't work that well? There's a huge opportunity with this in a world where we have many more precision medicine. So if precision medicines come with a genomic or proteomic biomarker attached to them, and I know that the drug works better in patients with a particular mutation, then I can charge those patients more, and I can charge less for the patients who don't have that mutation. So there's a huge opportunity with the intersection of indication-based pricing and precision medicine. Now, I think one challenge with just kind of looking at spending all the time is you get really focused on spending. If we're trying to move to a value-based healthcare system, what we want to do is measure patient outcomes, the totality of patient outcomes, and divide by the totality of spending. The previous slides may have overemphasized the spending problem and did nothing about outcomes. If you look at this recent paper that came out in Health Affairs a few weeks ago, you can see the tremendous improvement in survival that we have produced as a nation for patients with metastatic breast cancer. And this is not all about the drugs. This is also about improvements in the delivery system and improvements in diagnosis and things like that. But it is absolutely true that in a very narrow window of 10 years, we have seen that survival curve move up in a way that none of us really expected 10 years ago. And that's a wonderful thing. And if you ask what was the cost of those survival improvements, it actually looks quite good. So, for something like breast cancer, again, according to these authors, on average, we spent about $70,000 more to treat breast cancer patients, again, with metastatic breast cancer over their lifetime, but we generated something like a little over a year of life as a result. For something like kidney cancer, we spent about $45,000 and generated about 8 months additional of life. And so the cost effectiveness, at least in this setting, looks better than I would have expected going into this conversation. But it's a way of highlighting the importance of measuring the stuff on the left. We have to do a much better job of measuring the value of these therapies, and that goes well beyond doing what these people did, which is already very hard to do. They looked at survival. But we want to think about other dimensions of survival, other dimensions of patient benefit that go beyond survival. Like, is this therapy something that they can take in their home? Or do they have to go to an outpatient infusion clinic for the therapy? Those are all dimensions of value that I think we have just started calculating. I wanted to kind of point out something that I'm very optimistic about, that a number of different organizations today have actually started for the first time the difficult task of measuring value. So you can see that there's a number of competing frameworks out there, from ASCO, from ISA, from Memorial Sloan, from the NCCN, and they all vary in different ways. What I like about these frameworks is that they're all trying to do the right thing. They're trying to measure not only spending, which is the denominator of the value equation, but they're trying to measure outcomes, which is the numerator of the value equation. I think these are all frameworks that are in version 1, but some of them are quite exciting. So Peter's framework, for example, puts a lot of weight on things like the, whether or not there were adverse events and things like that. And I like that a lot. What I don't like about Peter's framework that much is he builds in R&D costs as a thing that he wants to pay for. And as an economist, I don't like paying for some costs. So we disagree about some of this, but we agree on the general enterprise. I think one thing that these frameworks all have to do going forward is not only help payers figure out which drugs are the right drugs to pay for, but also to inform patients about what's the right drug for them. And I think it's another way of saying the frameworks that are developed for payers might be quite different than the frameworks that we develop for patients, and that's some more work that we have to do. So let me just wrap up by saying, in the years to come, there's a number of challenges in front of us. We are going to see price increases from more risky ventures. And this is true not only in oncology, this is just true in medicine. As more of the big biopharma companies move into an area of research like Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the graveyard of biopharma companies. Prices will be high for companies that are actually successful, and the same thing will be true in oncology. Precision medicines are likely to be expensive. They're likely to be expensive for a number of reasons, but I want to highlight 2. First is they come with biomarkers, which mean that we can charge more for the patients in whom the drug works better. That's probably a good thing, but it's something that we don't think about when we say value-based purchasing. The other thing is that many of these drugs will address orphan indications and orphan cancers. So manufacturers will get 7 years of exclusivity instead of 5. That's part of the deal. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but that does mean that the prices will be high. I think that we're going to see a raft of multi-manufacturer combination therapies. This is a challenge for negotiation by plans. It's going to be a challenge for negotiation because now, rather than playing manufacturer A against manufacturer B and getting a rebate from manufacturer B, if manufacturers A and B decide to launch a combination therapy, that reduces Steve Miller or Troy Brennan's ability to kind of see the same level of competition that we saw in the marketplace. But I also think there's a number of opportunities that we should never lose sight of. First, we have seen the FDA approve more and more biosimilars on a faster and faster basis. Anything that we can do as a country to preserve this nascent market, I think this is a new market, and I think it's important that we don't screw it up by being overly optimistic about what it can do, is a good thing in the very long run. I think Part B payment reform is desperately needed. I'm probably going to get into a lot of trouble with the oncologists in the room for saying that I think it's a terrible idea that oncologists are paid a tip to be basically a paid sales force for pharmaceutical companies. I think that's a bad thing, and we should shut it down. The third thing that I think we should be thinking about, which is hard to think about, is I think we're going to need more innovative pricing. Some of these drugs are so expensive that it's very hard to absorb the budget impact of these drugs all at once. And I think that if we really believe in the principles of insurance and what insurance is, then insurance is about spreading risk over time and over more people, and we should be thinking about ideas like drug mortgages. I think that there's a huge opportunity to reduce the cost of cancer care by moving towards bundle and episode-based payments. That's not where we're going as a country. As a country, we seem to be continuing a very haphazard experiment with ACOs, which don't appear to be saving a lot of money. But I think that the leading cancer centers, when faced with the right financial incentives through bundle payments, will probably do a much better job of figuring out what drug is the right drug for a certain group of patients, and actually squeeze out a bunch of waste and inefficiency by cutting out advanced surgeries in the end of life, for example. And finally, it's always been my conviction that none of this is going to happen without physicians showing the way. So I think any physician-led bundle or any physician-led episode payment is likely to succeed a lot more and a lot faster than any government-led ACO payment or bundle. So I've given you a very high overview of, I think, what the issues are, and I look forward to learning a lot more from all my friends on the panel.
So I wanted to start the session, and we've heard a little from you on this, just to get your perspective on rising costs and what that means and what your opinions are. Maybe I'll start with you, please, Roy.
So rising costs are bad. We can delve into that greater. I think that the question that's frequently asked of the payer world is, how do you view this? And the point that I try to make for folks is that we as payers are merely reflections of the people we serve. And so let's get into that a little deeper. 1/3 of Medicare patients are now in Medicare Advantage, which means they choose on an annual basis with whom they're going to be insured and at what price point they're willing to pay. If you think about most of you in the room, you work for, by and large, larger companies, and you are usually in self-insured plans. And your employer has people who are looking at costs, and they're working with the payer in terms of how to hold costs down. So, we on the payer side really view ourselves as reflections of what people are asking of us, which I think is important. And if the question is, are we worried about paying for innovation? The answer is no. But we really want to ensure that the innovation that occurs is meaningful. And meaningful either from true extension of life or significant reduction in morbidity associated with the treatments. If we see that value and we can understand it and build it in actuarially, then we're fine. We can spread that in an insurance mechanism over the population. So that's how I believe the payers view costs.
Okay, Josh.
So from Amgen's perspective, we're very sensitive to and aware of the concern about rising healthcare costs. And that is an important element, and it's been focused on the rising spending and the rising costs of biopharmaceuticals. And we recognize that for cancer drugs, for example, they're just about 1% of overall healthcare spending. But we recognize that from a payer's perspective, they are seeing rising costs year over year, and we understand that. But we do have to take a step back and recognize that we are at a time where we really are on the verge of a complete breakthrough, a revolution in biotechnology and human genomics, and that this is affording us unbelievable opportunities, as Amitabh's slide showed. So I think what's happening is everybody's viewing this challenge from their very narrow silo, And we need to take a step back and look at this more holistically because, in fact, we are winning this war on cancer. The death rate for cancer has dropped well over 22% in the last 2 decades. If you begin to think about the 14 million estimated patients in the US by the CDC who have a cancer diagnosis and the almost 4 years of extra life that have been afforded over the last 2 decades, that's about 54 million life years that have been gained in this country and over the last 2 decades. And if you just conservatively value those years of life, you get about almost $5 trillion dollars in economic value. So the return on investment is just unequivocal and remarkable in cancer. And so as we think about the cost of cancer and the prices of cancer drugs, it has to be put into that context. And what I see happening, and to the point that was raised before, is we're not necessarily having the right conversation about value. If we were having a real conversation about value, we would be thinking and talking about how to stop paying for things that don't work. And for things that do work, how to make sure patients had unfettered access to those things. We'd be talking about value-based insurance design to make sure that there's enough discrimination between patients where a single drug may be high value to one patient and low value to another. They should pay very different out-of-pocket costs for those things. Those are the types of things we would be talking about if we were having a real conversation about value. But instead, the conversation we're having is about how to put budget caps on biopharmaceuticals. And we have to remember that budget impact, while very important and impactful, and we need to talk about that, has absolutely nothing to do with value. Budget impact is about volume, not about value, which is exactly the opposite of where we're trying to go in healthcare, which is to move from a system that rewards volume to a system that rewards value. If we were having a real conversation about value, we'd be focused on the $700 billion in waste in this country and the $400 billion in clearly low-value services that are given every year. But that's not at all what we're hearing in this conversation. So I would like us all to have a more honest conversation about value, because what I worry about today is that we're really having a conversation about budgets disguised in a conversation about value. And I think that needs to change. And thank you, Amitabh, for elucidating a lot of this, because just looking at spending of cancer drugs without looking at the health impact will mislead the conversation. And you will find that we are spending lots of money, but when you account for the spending by folding in the health effects, the impact, you see that there is tremendous value even in these high-cost cancer drugs.
I'd like to endorse what Josh highlighted for us in terms of wasted expenditures. That's an incredibly important area to concentrate on, I think, because we're all interested in achieving the outcomes that are most important to patients and the broader public at the lowest possible cost. So that careful reconsideration and prioritization is an essential part of the solution. I worry about costs because they're of concern to everyone, particularly those who pay those costs, but it's got an even larger impact in the poor, the underserved of the global population. So we see this in our own country, in large sectors of the population without access to clinical care and without proper evaluation and consideration and priority given to preventive approaches that could complement oncology care. But the issue is even larger when you step outside of our own country and take a global perspective. So cost is important to us, but even more important to those that aren't currently being served.
Do you think that prevention, I mean, we've talked a little bit about drugs maybe taking out costs from the healthcare system. What about prevention? I mean, is there a role for that in also sort of upstream? We've been hearing that, breast cancer screening, universal breast cancer screening, maybe not as effective as we thought it was. I mean, what is that? Where does that fit in this whole kind of value framework that we're talking about?
So, I'm going to look to my oncology friends in the audience for the answer to that. As an economist who looks at the evidence, I think at the end of the day, it's a bit naive to think that prevention for oncology is going to be the way forward. I think we should not smoke, and I'll say that 10 times. That matters a lot. We should definitely not smoke. But I think in terms of, I worry a lot that there are some really dangerous narratives out there around, if you don't eat these GMOs, you won't get cancer, and if you're doing a lot of yoga, you won't get cancer. And I think there's just very little evidence for any of that. And I think it puts the conversation in a very safe space. No one is opposed to prevention. At the end of the day, manufacturers will innovate, and we have to figure out how we're going to pay for that innovation. And I think the conversation around prevention, no one's opposed to that, but it gets in the way of figuring out how to pay for the drugs that we want patients to have access to, or not paying for the drugs that we think are not worth the price.
So I practiced medical oncology for 22 years. I took care of a lot of patients. I agree with your comments on yoga, et cetera. The issue is that there is a role for colonoscopies. There is a role for mammography. There is a role for a large number of cancer screenings. CT for patients who've smoked to determine early lung cancer. These are all, good things. The problem in our system is that in the commercial insurance world that we have right now, that most of us are in, there's a turnover of the population every 2.5 years. And so you have a lack of alignment of incentives. So if you have a payer who's paying for every single appropriate screening test, in 2.5 years that person leaves, and everyone else is not doing what you are doing in terms of screening, you are at a disadvantage. You may be doing the right thing, but you're at a disadvantage, which is why there needs to be standardization for all of these processes if we're going to continue to have this churn within the commercial side. Now, on the Medicare Advantage side, in our population, most of our patients stay with us for 8 years. So we have a great incentive, both from a medical oncology standpoint, as well as from a financial one, to optimally prevent cancer in our population once we see them. And so I think the funding mechanism becomes really important in terms of to be used as a lever to ensure that good policy actually occurs.
I mean, we've been talking about this generally in America. I've heard this conversation for many years about this problem of churn. And I mean, I don't get a sense that we're any closer to a solution to that problem. Would that be accurate?
I think that's an issue.
So, I mean, one solution presumably would be for the government to mandate that certain tests are done by all insurers. That would be one solution. Is there some other idea?
Well, there are a number of ideas, and I think the fundamental question you're asking, we can get into prevention, and obviously, if we are able to do early detection for prevention, obviously there will be tremendous value to that. And there are companies working on the molecular genetics of that right now, but we're quite a ways away from that, and I think we're going to be with colonoscopies and mammographies for quite some time. But that is a potential disruptive approach to cancer care. So that's happening out there. But the more fundamental question is, how are we going to pay for cancer care? Amitabh keeps saying, how are we going to pay for cancer drugs? My question is more, how are we going to pay for cancer care? It's a superordinate question that's very important because that ultimately we need to figure out to put physicians in the best position to use the technologies that they believe are most effective. And the best example of that is in a real-world experiment that was done by United Healthcare, where they actually gave a set of oncology clinics prepayment for all the care of patients and left the choices to physicians. And they didn't dictate care or anything like that. And then they we're told, maintain the outcomes of those patients and try to reduce overall spending. And in fact, they did. They reduced, compared to their control clinics, which were doing usual care, they reduced overall spending by over 30%. They increased drug spending by almost 180%. So left in the hands of clinicians were making choices about where to spend their dollar, what technologies to rely on. I think the hypothesis going into that study was that if that physicians would just use a lot less drugs and spend much less on drugs, and that actually wasn't the case at all. So I think the question is, how do we affect spending in cancer? Okay, because again, drug spending is about 20% now of all cancer spending, and we need to look at it much more holistically, and we need to leave it in the hands of the oncologists, because care is changing in such a dynamic way that and even within an individual tumor, over time, the genomics of that tumor is changing. And so we really need to let physicians allocate resources appropriately where they think they're going to get the most value.
Of course, I can't leave prevention where Amitabh left it. Considering non-evidence-based strategies, right now the best academic estimates of the potential impact of prevention on the cancer problem are that a third to a half of cancers that occur in the American population are indeed preventable. To have effective preventive programs, you need evidence-based strategies operating at the population level as well as in the clinic. And this whole conference is concentrating on the clinic, but that population aspect of it is critically important. So things like absolutely tobacco, there's no reason for tobacco to exist even, and yet because of the lack of political will in our country to make that substance banned, we live with this conundrum. But avoiding tobacco, being physically active, eating properly across the lifespan, limiting excessive and certainly artificial UV irradiation, these things can have a major impact. And when we're talking about the economics of cancer, it would be irresponsible to concentrate only on therapy and ignore these things that we know can have a very broad and significant impact. And the impact is not only in reducing cancer, of course, but also promoting healthful life. So you get a twofer every time you concentrate on an effort in primary prevention. And yet, because the country doesn't yet have one cancer control plan, I work with the NCI right now globally, helping countries establish cancer control plans where you're taking evidence-based practice, not yoga, but evidence-based practices and putting them in place at population level. Yeah, absolutely, diet's a part of it. So we're working all across the globe to help countries develop these, and yet you ask, does America have one? The answer is no. We have 51 individual state and district plans, but we haven't come together to really prioritize prevention. The Affordable Care Act was a step in that direction because finally we can reimburse for some of these evidence-based preventive services that we know make an impact. But it's not gone nearly far enough in advancing the conversation around the importance of these strategies at a population level, to say nothing of those that can be implemented in a clinic toward high-risk individuals.
I hope that people don't walk away from this thinking that the solution is to give each physician a pot of money to go and take care of a patient. I don't think that's, and I'm not going to speak for Josh, but I don't think that, I want to be clear that that's not what at least I believe. In that United study, 3 or 4 of those practices were in groups that I was the chief medical officer for. The way that a lot of the savings was achieved was through the use of clinical pathways and guidelines, which actually did look at evidence-based medicine. And I think that the point that I want to get across in terms of how we're going to deal with a lot of this is going back to something that you and I had talked about before the meeting started, which is the appropriate use of evidence-based medicine. And without that, we really can't move forward. I am 100% supportive of physicians having significant choice, but it has to be evidence-based driven. Otherwise, there is such variability and high cost, that we as a nation, we really can't afford that.
I'm going to go to Josh next because he winced more than you did.
He winced more than I did?
Well, so I think you're raising a really important point about
So we may not agree.
the importance of clinical pathways and guidelines and evidence-based medicine. And, for years, I grew up in the field of evidence-based medicine. And I'll tell you the issue that exists around evidence-based medicine in oncology is the most important. Evidence-based medicine at its core is epidemiologic, which means it's about the averages, okay? It's about creating guidelines and pathways around how the average patient responds on average to any particular intervention. A very important concept. And in medicine, I'm a big believer in evidence-based medicine. But in the direction that oncology is moving, I worry about a disconnect between that epidemiologic approach to setting guidelines and practice, parameters, and how individualized cancer care is going to get and must be. And I think as long as we can figure that relationship out, I think we're in agreement. But I do worry about the ability to maintain that relationship.
But I think really high quality pathways can deliver precision medicine to the individual.
Then I think that's the key.
Absolutely.
Because the only alternative to evidence is lack of evidence.
Well, no, it's not that evidence. So evidence exists.
Right.
And evidence will always guide our thinking. The question is, as you aggregate evidence around the averages and then you apply it in a one-size-fits-all approach at the average, that is the challenge.
Right. But you're not sitting here and saying, let's not have evidence.
No. Evidence is the cornerstone of all of it.
I mean, you wanted to say something?
Well, I just wanted to build on that. At the end of the day, I think cancer care is way too complicated for it to be given even perhaps to a single oncology practice, let alone an oncologist. It probably has to be given to much larger teams of oncologists who are working with surgeons, who are working with internists, who are working with cardiologists. And I'm thinking of these ideas around integrated practice units. In terms of amassing the evidence, what we want to build some sort of a Waze app, right? Which is, we're not going to be able to do the trials. That's the thing. So I'm all in favor of the trials.
So cancer Waze?
Cancer Waze would be a way to go.
But
the idea would be that it would be terrific if we could get the leading academic cancer centers to combine data on either their own and not shared with each other, but if these centers, they're essentially doing thousands and thousands of haphazard experiments every day, but they're not tracking particularly well what happens to given patients. Right. But their data is the opportunity, and I would trust a pathway built by Memorial Sloan or MD Anderson a lot more than a pathway built by a commercial pathway company, because I worry a lot that a commercial pathway company could build a pathway that saves a ton of money. The denominator of the value equation doesn't do a particularly good job of measuring the numerator, but it's my hope, and this is an unproven hope, that the leading cancer centers will do a better job of measuring the numerator and the denominator. And so my hope is that if we could get them to kind of brand around, their scientific credibility, we'd get richer, better pathways for cancer patients.
I want to move the conversation on a bit because we're running short of time. And although this is a very interesting conversation, what I would really like to hear about is some more discussion about value. And from a patient's perspective, and perhaps even from a member of the general public, the discussion about value-based pricing is probably a bit surprising. For everyone in this room, it's like, well, why wouldn't that be sensible? But a lot of people will kind of imagine that that's the way that things work, and why on earth would we pay a lot of money for drugs that don't work? But that is indeed what we have been doing for a long time. Let's talk about getting innovative. We've heard little bits of mentions of things like indication-based pricing and bundles. Just each of you, could you tell me, we'll start with you, Ernest, it may not be quite your area, but just tell me what you think value-based pricing means and what it means to be innovative and what could work. And everyone could please answer the same question.
I'll take the broader perspective of cancer care and not focus on drugs per se, because that's not my area of expertise. The broader issue of how much does it care to take care of a cancer patient is a question that's very difficult to answer. At Anderson, Amitabh and I were speaking about this before coming in. At Anderson, we've undertaken an effort led by Tom Feely to try to get to what are the real costs of care. We're using time-dependent, activity-based pricing to try to capture all the interactions that occur in the proper care and in an inpatient setting in particular, the care of cancer patients. We began in the head and neck, and we've explored a couple of other areas. It becomes an extremely difficult task to try to value each of the interactions that occur, assign a price, and do that across the full spectrum of a disease. We're making steps in that direction. So the answer, to my mind, is, first of all, how much does it cost to actually provide care? Not how much do we charge or how much are we reimbursed, but how much does it actually cost to provide that? I don't think there are great answers to that question right now. We're taking steps in that direction to try to provide answers.
I mean, that must be the foundation of some of the efforts that are going on within hospitals under Obamacare, because you have to know where your costs are, right?
Well, at least in oncology, I'm not aware of many other similar efforts to really get at this issue. It's extremely difficult. It's taken a lot of time and effort. We've been at it for a couple of years, just working in a couple of different models, leukemia as well as head and neck cancer.
So even if we're going to do value-based pricing in drugs, it may be that we're not going to be able to get an answer to the question of, what's the most efficient way of spending on cancer care, because we still don't know what the care bed costs.
So I think that's a fair point, but let me make just a quick comment about your question, which is, let me make a comment about value-based pricing, and then maybe some thoughts about what we can do, what we ought to be doing. So, the issue around value-based pricing is that as we move from a system of volume to value, we want to make sure that everything we pay for is aligned with value. But whose version of value? The most important thing people may not recognize, there is no single answer to the question of value. What is of value to an individual may vary quite dramatically. So we need to be understanding the value of the interventions that we bring. But to use, so you've all heard about ICER earlier this morning. That's one group that's trying to develop value-based prices. They're using a method called cost-effectiveness analysis. But to make statements about value using cost-effectiveness analysis, you must impose thresholds to make statements about value. And who is setting those thresholds on behalf of patients? Today, unfortunately, what I'm seeing is it's a very paternalistic approach. ICER, for example, is using criteria developed from the World Health Organization based on per capita GDP and saying that's your threshold. And that's coming in at somewhere between $100,000 to $150,000 per life year saved. And but when you actually go to patients and ask patients how they value a year of life, those numbers are often quite different, and particularly different for cancer patients.
But I mean, are you objecting to the principle of setting a threshold?
No, so the idea of assessing value is critically important, but we have to be asking ourselves the question, whose version of value? So when we look at cancer patients...
If you ask a CEO what his life year is worth, it's going to be very different to what my value is. So, but by raising this issue of what patient valuation, you're essentially just muddying the water.
Well, you could argue on the one hand you're muddying the water. On the other hand, you're actually trying to understand how actual patients value years of life, which is the goal here. So what I'm saying is the assessments that we do need to be patient-centric. Some of the analyses, Amitabh mentioned one of them, looked at plotting in a very back-of-the-envelope way, kind of median overall survival reported from clinical trials versus time, showing that we're paying more today and getting less than we did in the past. Patients don't care about median overall survival as an endpoint in clinical trials. They care about their actual survival. And the next study Amitabh showed actually measured the actual survival of the patients in the real world and found that these drugs were of enormous value. So we have to do this in a patient-centric way. But there's a lot we can do, and let me make a couple suggestions. You've heard, so one, we're bringing Amgen, for example, is bringing biosimilars to market. That's a really important thing to address some of the affordability issues in cancer. We need to modernize the payment system in Medicare to be able to do indication-specific pricing. We need to change some of our policies around FDAMA 114 in the FDA so that Roy and I can have really good business-to-business conversations about value and inform you way before we bring drugs to market about what's coming so you can plan appropriately. And right now, we can't have those conversations. We need to reduce the costs of manufacturing biologics, which we're working on very hard, and we need to be able to have value-based partnerships between institutions, biopharmaceutical manufacturers, payers, and others to drive more value into the healthcare system. But we need a lot of policy reform to make that happen, and we're very committed to that.
So,
Roy, can you answer that? But also, can you pick up Josh on this? Should value be patient-centric?
yeah, I'm going to get there.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to be simple because, I'm an oncologist and I'm a very simple human being. But I don't know of any other system in the world that the person who produces the entity says, this is what I'm going to charge you, and everyone then accepts it. And the way that the decision is made is based on their perceived savings in terms of life extension and quality. So if I were to do that same thing when I was a surgical resident, had I done a small surgical procedure for an appendectomy for a 19-year-old, I would have come back and said, I'm going to charge you $3.4 million because that's the amount of savings that you're going to get in your life. Now, no one's going to pay the surgeon $3.4 million. I mean, the surgeon would have liked it, but that's not the way the system works. And so, I go back and challenge the premise in terms of how we're moving in terms of value moving forward. Right now, the hospital systems at Harvard, they are taking risk in terms of the care of their patient population. Nursing homes do the exact same thing. Laboratory companies are taking risk for all of the laboratories that they do. With MACRA and APMs and things like this, people are now taking risk. The folks that are not taking risk are the manufacturers in terms of pharmaceuticals. And I go back and challenge and say, if everyone else is playing in this game, why are they not?
Joseph Curtis, I'm with Cascade Biotherapeutics. The question that I have relates to biologics manufacturing as it relates to making products available to specific patient populations. It appears that there's a spectrum of risk, especially on the teams that are doing the discovery, the R&D, as well as continuing to refine the biologics manufacturing process. How is it that that's not reflected in your understanding here? If the product fails, the companies go under. You just basically said that earlier about Alzheimer's products. So there is an incentive for companies to particularly try to find inventive ways to deliver new therapies to the marketplace, as well as be able to generate some type of measurable profit. You cannot continue to make the manufacturers the villains here. As this gentleman here pointed out, there's tremendous amounts of waste here.
What's the question?
The question is where do you guys factor in what's going on at the actual bench level in the labs there?
All right, thank you very much. Anyone want to pick up that question?
Roy just said that everyone in the system is taking risk except the manufacturers. So let me just maybe address that. I think in the market, I can only speak for Amgen, we are very happy to engage with payers and PBMs and take risk around our products. And we're trying to do innovative things around the way we contract that risk. That's why we need some policy change. But much more fundamentally, our industry is based on risk. Amgen spends about $4.3 billion a year in R&D. Once products are in clinical trials, most of them fail. About 5 to 10% will make it to the market. So this is an enormous, it's enormously costly and risky to bring drugs to market. And there too often people say, well, you charge X, but it only cost Y to develop that drug. That's not how we think about pricing. We're pricing based on a portfolio where 95% of the trials fail. And we need to price in a way that can maintain a portfolio that is about $4.3 billion a year of R&D. And of course, we begin by anchoring those prices in value, in a broad social perspective around how we measure value. That's where it starts. So hopefully that's helpful.
How do we get existing generic drugs which have shown improvement in outcome into the marketplace? There's no financial support for moving that needle.
So I think if you move to a model of bundled payments or episode payments and you give MD Anderson a big pot of money to take care of breast cancer patients or patients with metastatic colon cancer, they have every incentive not to use the brand name drug and every incentive to find a generic or the generic combination therapy that's just as good as Josh's drug. Now, it turns out that they tend to like the newer drugs, and that's an okay thing then. That means that the generic wasn't as good. But so my own view is let the doctors figure it out by basically giving them the right financial incentives not to overuse the high-cost drugs.
I'd like to thank all my panelists for a fascinating discussion. I could have gone on for another 20 minutes. We've heard that drugs actually do add value throughout the system. They're not just a cost, they are helping with cancer care. But deciding how to pay for that and what that value is a very contentious subject and one I'm sure I will be thinking about and writing about in the years to come.